Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the latest episode of The Hard Compound Live. For those of you who don't know, my name's Rich and I run and operate The Hard Compound, a one-stop shop for all things motorsport on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube. Just search for The Hard Compound on any of those and give us a follow. We do 2 or 3 posts a day on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, morning, evening and lunchtime as well. These are either race reviews, race previews, any breaking news, any throwbacks, birthdays, and just any motorsport stuff that we come across that we'd like to share with you across those platforms. So do come and join us. Firstly, to those tuning in from the UK, I do hope you've enjoyed the British Touring Cars today at Knock Hill. Absolutely fantastic day of racing. As you might have noticed, we also do these live video interviews. These are on our Facebook, our Twitter and our YouTube channels live, and they save automatically. They're in the video section on our Facebook and in the live section on our YouTube. We've had some fantastic guests. I'm not going to name them all, but this is interview number 106, I believe, from across the motorsport spectrum, whether it be F1, touring cars, bikes, NASCAR, IndyCar, and everything in between. We've had the honour and the privilege of speaking with the likes of Mr. Mario Andretti, with Mr. Jackie X, John Watson, a lot of the British touring car drivers, past and present, same as the European and world touring cars, and we've had drivers from the worlds of F1 and IndyCar as well from yesteryear, and some current races as well. Tonight we have another fantastic guest, or this afternoon if you're tuning in from stateside. He's raced in single seaters. He's raced in sports cars. He's competed at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. He's competed in F1. He's raced in DTM. He's raced in F2 and F3 in the Americas, and much, much more. And he's also the owner of Berg Racing Schools. So, without any further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Mr. Berg himself.
Hello, Richard.
And there we are. Alan, how are you?
I am just great. Thank you very much for having me on your program.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. Obviously, we've had to, move a few dates around to suit ourselves, but I'm delighted that we've actually managed to get this together. So, and I really, really appreciate you sparing your afternoon to come and have a chat with us.
It's my pleasure.
Fantastic. As I said off air, young me is very excited about this because I love the '86 F1 season, and that was your year in F1, which we'll of course come to a little bit later on. Excuse me. Just so to those tuning in, if you do want to put any comments or questions in the comment section on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, whichever you're tuning in on, do put them in there, and we'll see them as they come up. So we'll try and work them into the chat as well. So I guess it's a Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening. Nice relaxed chat. Looking forward to it. We're obviously going to speak about your career, Alan, and obviously that of your son, Alex, who is he's doing very well already, isn't he? But before then, I guess we have to start right at the start. I mean, where did your interest in motorsport come from? Because you're from Vancouver over there on the
born in Vancouver, but raised in Calgary, Alberta from about 2 years of age. And I guess my interest in racing started from watching Wide World of Sports on ABC television that we would get in Canada when, back in those days, there was 2 channels and the TV was black and white. And I remember watching these very short, like 2-minute snippets on Grand Prix racing in Europe back in the time, of course, in those days of Stewart, Clark, and the drivers that would run at those tracks like the Nürburgring, and they're very, very short, and I just had a fascination by that, and that's kind of where my interest in Formula One started. Of course, this is well before the internet era, and the only information that we would get in Canada on that would be these very short segments, and there would be more on IndyCar racing and NASCAR racing, and maybe it was simply the inaccessibility, the exclusivity of Formula One being a European or world championship level sport that really interested me. So coming from a very young age, there was very little information, but that's where that's where it first caught my attention, about 4 years of age.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess that because it wasn't a North American only series, it kind of had a little extra to it, and I can relate to that. I'm a huge IndyCar fan, and it's
Yeah.
because America seems so far away from here when you're a kid, that it's got the extra sort of attraction to it. So I
Yeah.
can, and
Yeah.
obviously the era that you were watching in as well. I mean, what an era! I mean,
Yeah.
wish I'd been around. But I mean, so you obviously got the interest in it. When did you first think, "Oh, I'd love to have a go"?
Well, I think it always started right from then, just like any other, child. You dream of being an astronaut or president of the United States or being a racing driver. So it was a dream that, one day I'd love to race in Europe. I'd love to live in England. I'd love to race in Formula One in Europe and be a professional racing driver. And then just over the years, it stayed as a dream until I was able to, start to get involved with racing. And as the years progressed, and it just seemed that it could become more and more of a, possible reality. It wasn't like from one day to the another that I had just decided to start to choose to become a professional racing driver, and I think that's probably very common with all drivers. It's always a dream, and then at some point in time it transitions into something that could become a reality, and then eventually for those that are very lucky it does become a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And and you obviously went on to have a hugely varied career racing in many different disciplines, which
Yeah.
I think is a true test of a driver's skill rather than just staying in one route. And you began in karting
Yes.
like so many did.
Hmm.
Um, was there somewhere local where you could just go like to a kart track and just have a go?
No, not really. The closest kart track was in Edmonton, which was about 200 miles away. Which back in those days when I started in, I think 1977 or 78, and that was a long distance. And I never actually had been to a kart race before. One day my dad came home with some information that was given to him by a friend that said, "Hey, there's go kart racing that goes on." And I said, "Yeah, let's do it." And so we kind of came up with a plan that I would work, and I had a paper route at the time. I'd save up some money and put half the money in to be able to buy a go kart. And I think back in those days to buy a go kart with a motor, um, with a McCullough two-stroke racing engine, motor, it was around just over $1,000 to buy a brand new kart. And so over a period of time, I saved up some money, and then my dad and I got a go kart together,
Wow.
and started racing. Prior to that, I'd been able to go to a couple of Can-Am races, which were in Edmonton at Edmonton International Raceway, I think it was, or Speedway, and I was able to see the Can-Am series in its heyday, and I was able to see, and I remember vividly watching and seeing Bruce McLaren, Denny Hulme, Jackie Eakes, Jackie Oliver, Mark Donohue,
I guess was it
Grand Prix
Dan
drivers
was it Dan Gurney
racing,
was
and Gurney as well, I
Gurney
believe,
was there?
racing at
Wow.
Edmonton International Speedway. And that was like when I was like 8 or 9 years of age. And I knew who those guys were.
Yeah.
And it was, of course, a lot more accessible. I didn't get a chance to meet any of the drivers, but we were able to get into the pits and look at some of those just fabulous Can-Am cars. And so that was an amazing, amazing experience for my dad and I to do, my father and I to go and do that. And in fact, my very first race that I ever did was in a go kart at Edmonton International Speedway. So
Wow. Wow. It must have been great to get out on track, having obviously been and to watch that amazing era of Can-Am racing, and then get out on track and
well,
race yourself. You
It,
must have been
it, it
kicking
was,
yourself.
yeah, it was pretty incredible to get out on track, and I tell you, I was so nervous. I my the fellow that was helping us out at the time told my dad that Alan went to take a pee about 5 times before the race. I was so nervous before I started. And the funny thing, Richard, is at the end of my career, my very last race, I remember before the start of the race, and this might sound maybe inappropriate, but I remember going to the bathroom about 5 times before that last race. And I think that lasted through my whole career, just the period of nerves. And I think it comes down to just when you really care about something or passionate about something. We have drivers that take our racing school and they're nervous when they get
Yeah.
in. If you don't care and if you're not nervous, it's kind of like, it maybe lack a bit of importance to you. I feel, but I think that, being nervous is just a sign of, caring about what you're doing, exploring the unknown and pushing your boundaries.
I'm so glad you said that, because this is going to sound really silly, but I get that before these chats sometimes. I think, oh God, I'm talking to so and so, and my wife is asking if I'm all right. So why you keep going to the loo?
I
But it's true,
understand.
because if you care about something and you want to do something properly, you get nervous about it. So,
Yes, sir.
and obviously, it's a bit more dangerous what you guys were doing than me sitting in a comfy chair. Um,
Yeah.
but you just did a couple of years, didn't you? I believe
Yes.
in
Yep.
karting
I
before
was
you
very
made the step
successful.
up.
Fortunately, I raced in Edmonton. My dad and I would load everything into the back of a van, a go kart, and a toolbox, and we go up and do a race, and we would fight, on the way up, and fight when we were there at the track. But it was, just a typical kind of father son relationship in go karting, they're the best years of racing that I remember. That, and of course what I'm doing right now with my own son, but had a lot of success right from the onset, and won in my first year the Alberta Juniors Championship, which all the races were in Edmonton, but it was the
Yeah,
Alberta Championship because it was the only track in Alberta. And the second year won the Alberta Senior Championship, and I think I finished first or second in the Western Canadian Championship as well, as far as I'm concerned. So at that point in time, Gilles Villeneuve was, of course, with Ferrari,
yeah,
and he was my hero, was my idol,
yeah.
and that was
And
a
it was for so
huge
many.
inspiration. When you have someone like that make it all the way,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And obviously, no disrespect to Canada, there hadn't been many real top drivers. I think he was the first real top one to get in F1,
Yes,
wasn't he? And
yes, he was. Yeah,
he was something else. And what a person to look up to. Um, as I said, that you did those 2 years, you had the success, so you obviously got some form of ability at this. Obviously,
mhm.
when did you then start thinking about moving into cars? Because was it into Formula Ford was the next step?
Yeah, yeah. It was. After this, I guess that it was always a dream, but you have to realize that in Western Canada, the sport, the sport is ice hockey, and every
Yeah,
other sport, in Canada, primarily in Western Canada, is ice hockey, and there's very little exposure or coverage for anything else. No internet, and so a lot of it is by word of mouth. You're really finding out about
mhm,
things, and we found out there was such a thing called the Calgary Sports Car Club that had races. Again, at Edmonton International Speedway, and my dad bought me an old Formula Ford race car, and we I put it together in a race shop. Had some help from some people, and going to those races, it wasn't just my dad and I. We needed to have a proper mechanic do it, but we were racing against a lot more modern cars, and winning races and podiuming there. In my first year, it attracted some attention from the Mossport Racing School, Mossport, Ontario,
yeah,
and from that I was able to transition to do some racing out in Eastern Canada, and that incorporated racing in the Pro Formula Ford series in the United States against some you know drivers that went on to do a lot of great things in a lot of different categories, including Scott Goodyear, of course. You
yeah. I
may
mean, he
remember.
was the one. When I did the research, he was the one that kind of
Yeah,
stood out to me. I mean, he's
yeah,
known
yeah.
for what happened in '92 in
Yeah,
the
we
Austin.
had some great battles. There
Yeah.
were some other great drivers that were for a brief period of time in IndyCar. Ludwig Heimrath Jr.
Oh yeah,
There's so many drivers, and racing in the United States. Of course, I raced against a lot of really top level drivers. John Paul Jr. Chip Ganassi was actually a pretty talented guy. Dave Wietzenoff, I think his name is, raced in Formula Ford for years. Is a legend over here. But big fields, and has some great weight racing out in Eastern Canada. Learned quite a bit more and was able to do a little bit of instructing as well too
oh,
along the
great.
way.
So that sort of started that ball rolling as well, which
Yep,
is
yep,
great. Some fantastic names. Obviously,
yeah,
Chip Ganassi's doing okay at the moment for himself,
yeah,
isn't he?
yeah. Yes, he is.
Yeah,
I see
yeah,
him from time to time, and we talk.
yeah.
So
Not too bad. I actually met him at the Indy 500 last year
yeah.
for about 4 seconds, and I was like, I
He's a busy guy, kind of an intimidating fellow.
was just going to say he's very intimidating, but until he smiles at you, then he's okay. But no, it's fantastic. I mean, so, and you went through, and you mentioned Scott Goodyear. He actually won the title that year. You
Mhm.
came second. But then I've got here that you won the Indian Summer Trophy win, which is a nice little thing to have. But then
Yeah.
the step up to Formula Atlantics.
I will show you something. Excuse, I don't know if I'm
No,
allowed to
go
do
for it.
this or not, but the Indian Summer Trophy, they gave me an Indian headdress,
Oh yeah, up
and I
there,
have that.
and
It's
that
an
and
authentic Indian headdress. I have it hanging in my office, and right
that's
below it is the actual trophy that I won. It's kind of, I put it up there because it's the most beautiful trophy that I ever won in my career. And my late mother, God bless her soul, when I won it, she preserved it in a box, and now I was able to finally put it out on display. But that's the Indian Summer Trophy
that you want.
from
That's
winning.
what a fantastic thing to have as well. Absolutely
I
brilliant.
don't ever wear it. No.
Oh, surely you got every now and again just. um, but that's fantastic. I absolutely love that. But you made the step into Formula Atlantics. Was that the first time in a sort of slicks and wing type arrangement that you had?
I guess so. Yes, in Formula Atlantic, and I had the opportunity of racing with a team that was based out of Los Angeles, and my engineer was a legendary Carroll Smith, and his son Chris actually is still a very close friend of mine, and I learned a great deal, and lived in his house with his family, and we raced in the North American Formula Atlantic Championship that year, and I think finished fifth overall in
Yeah,
the
I've got
series.
in the notes, fifth overall, and for a first season in a true single
Yeah,
seater, I guess.
pretty competitive category. Of course, that was the category that a lot of great drivers came out of. Gilles Villeneuve, Bobby Rahal, Danny Sullivan.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. I
so
remember.
many drivers came from
I
out of
think
Formula Atlantic.
I spoke with Alonso Jr. on here, and I think he came through that route, and he said he loved it. He said him and Danny Sullivan were always having a
Yeah, Michael Andretti
pop at
certainly
each
did.
other.
Yeah.
Wow, that's my era of IndyCar drivers. So it's incredibly strong, proving ground, and you've obviously taken fifth. Excuse me, in that first year. And you mentioned with that little small-ish team, and then you switched to Doug Shearson Racing, who obviously he
Yeah.
went on, had IndyCar, Indy 500 winners and stuff. What was it like working with
Well,
him?
it was a step back from where I was.
Hmm.
I had this small team that really supported me and great friends, but the opportunity came to drive for Shearson, who was the factory March team at the time. The previous year, the driver was and their number one driver was Jacques Villeneuve,
Oh wow, okay.
brother of Gilles,
Yeah,
uncle of
yes, the
Nick.
older one. Yeah.
Yes, correct. Great driver, just a superb driver. But the year that I came into the team, it probably was the worst March that was ever produced.
Oh, I see.
And and so it was kind of just a bad wrong step, and the results were very poor. And I think, looking back on it, Richard, it probably had a very negative effect on my reputation as a driver in North
Right.
America, because here is a guy that didn't really should be a front runner but wasn't at the front. And of course,
I guess people.
drivers will blame the cars, but in this case, it really was the case. It wasn't a very good race car.
Yeah, sure. And I guess people see the name, like, they see the name racing and think, oh, well, he's going to do well there. And it's not always the case. I mean, just look at, bring it into the modern days, just a few years ago, look at McLaren. I mean, it was just a mess. And I don't think anyone would have got anything out of the car. So,
But I learned a huge amount, particularly through the engineering staff he had. That was the first year that he was also getting into IndyCar. And I think that was a bit of a factor, because one thing I learned is the team that has ambitions to move up, their focus then became on running in IndyCar. He had Domino's Pizza, and as the major sponsor, as well
yeah.
as the driver was Howdy Holmes.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah.
so their focus, of course, was on, and it was just a very small shop based in Adrian, Michigan. So
Right.
it just factors worked against me. But through there, I was able to meet some of the engineers that he had working on these teams, British based, and it kind of really whet my appetite for seeing what I could do about going to Europe, right?
Right.
With the
That
Gilles
was the
Villeneuve
start of
being
the
there.
thought
Of
process.
course, the aspiration of any driver is Formula One, but it showed me that it can be done if a driver has the right opportunities and really sets his mind to it. It can be done for a Canadian.
So that kind of set the ball rolling for the move to F3, the big move to Europe, and I've spoken to a number of people from your side of the pond,
Mhm.
guys like Roberto Moreno and other people like that, and they said that they love what they were doing at home, but obviously at the time, British F3 or certainly European F3 was, if you wanted to go towards F1, that was the route that you took. But that must be quite a big move for you, having only done a couple
It
of
was
years.
really drastic. Everyone was saying how competitive Europe was, and of course I believe them. During that season, I had a little bit of help from Gaston Perron. Gaston was Gilles Villeneuve's manager,
Right.
business manager. He assisted him with his business affairs. He made an introduction to me to the publisher of Grand Prix International magazine, Michel Koenig, and so that company, Grand Prix International, sponsored me and assisted me in my move to the British Formula 3
Right.
Championship
Right.
the following year. So again, no internet, no magazines. The magazines that would arrive would be Autosport magazines that would arrive to Canada 3 months late. So my
Wow.
very first contact with England was through a journalist known as Jeremy Shaw. He lives in Los Angeles now, runs the Team USA Scholarship Shootout.
Right.
He was working for working for Autosport magazine at the time. So I just called him out of the blue, and I was started asking him questions, and he suggested some teams that I should speak to, and I spoke to the teams,
Wow.
and with Grand Prix International, behind me, I was able to make the move to England. Prior to that, I did have an opportunity to race in the Tasman Series.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was in January of 1983, and that was in the car was it's called Formula Pacific, but it was the same car, Formula Atlantic car that what the series that I've been racing.
Okay.
And I
Originally.
went down there. I can't say I dominated the series, but I won the championship, won the majority of the races, and with the help of I guess with CPR and a couple of other companies that Graham Lawrence had put together for me down in New Zealand. I had a fabulous time down there, and then went from sunny New Zealand to February in England. I
Not so
moved.
sunny February.
Yeah, it was a bit of a culture shock, and I learned a great deal. It was of course, moving to England. You're going there with a goal in mind. And my view was that if I wanted to get to Formula One, I had to go to Europe, and the sooner the better. And the British Formula 3 Championship was like the stepping stone. It was kind of the talent pool at that time to get an opportunity in Formula One. The
Yeah.
champion or the top two in the series would always get a test with McLaren at the end of the year.
Right.
And so it seemed to me that's the series that I really need to try to aspire to.
Yeah.
So I moved to Woking, England. My roommates at that time were Chris Whitty, who was the PR director for Tolman, and Alan Jenkins, who's one of the McLaren race engineers.
Wow. That's
So
amazing. That's
yeah,
there's some. That's. I mean, now looking back, there's some big names
the
involved there.
stories that they told me was just awe-inspiring for I don't know if I was 23 or 22, 23 years old or 21. Just amazing to be this outsider, this kid from Calgary, to suddenly be listening to stories from a race engineer for Alan Prost. It just off the cuff, just so natural, telling me these different things that were
Just,
going on,
just like they're
with
just talking about a friend of theirs and chatting away, and
yeah,
it just happens to be Alan Prost. Wow.
yeah, yeah,
What an incredible kind of introduction to
yeah.
British F3. It was with like Neil Trundle Racing. You had
Right with you.
the Route RT3, which has become
Yeah,
known as one of the F3 cars at the time.
yeah.
What was it like to drive first time you got in it?
Well, I mean, with the Formula Atlantic car, and bear in mind the car that I was I kind of defaulted in settings to driving was the March, which is not a very good race car. It tended to need to be pitched into the corners, and a Formula 3 car at that time was about 160 to 165 horsepower. I think with the very the small air restrictor. The rev band was like from
Yeah,
5,000 to 6,200 or something like that. Very, very
wow,
small rev band.
narrow.
If you ran below that, you would detonate the motor, which would damage the motor and damage the head gasket. You get engine pinking. but the power would run out at like 6,200 RPM, and you had to be
Wow.
ultra smooth. And the tires that they ran on were Avons, which were just a little bit more grip than wood, but a really hard car to drive. You
Wow.
had to be ultra smooth, and of course, my driving style was not smooth. It was chucking the car in and trying to catch it, and I had to kind of relearn the technique of being smooth again and learning all these tracks in really cold conditions. So it was a very challenging time to be able to come back over there and run with, you know, running and learning, how to kind of learn the tracks and how to drive a race car properly again.
Wow. It's like, and obviously a complete shift from what you've been used to,
Yeah.
and that's the thing, like the change in driving style. People, non-racers, of which I am one, they don't perhaps not understand. They don't think about there's so many different ways to race. As you say, you can go at it, throw it in, catch it if
Mhm.
you need to, or you can just be nice and smooth. And there's so many variables. But what a car to have to do that to, to learn it all. That
Yeah.
was amazing. Did you have any expectations or thoughts or hopes going into the season? I mean, did you think you would be competitive genuinely
Well,
across the
going
board?
over there, I didn't know who any of the drivers were. Again, no information to go off of. I'm coming from halfway around the world, literally to be able to race in the series. I didn't know who these drivers were. I'd heard of this guy, Ayrton Senna, that had won, three-quarters of the races or 50% of the races that he entered, in the 2 years previously. And at that point in time, he was a competitor, a guy that I had to try to beat,
Yeah,
as the rest of them were. In my first race, I think I finished seventh, and I had a battle with another good driver named Mario Hitten from
yeah.
Switzerland that went on to do some great things. And I remember one time in the Thruxton backstraight coming along, my very first race, and I was pulling up alongside of him, and he just kind of ran me off onto the gravel on the side of the road.
Onto
And
the left as you go up the hill.
yeah, and then
Yeah,
I went to see the clerk of the course afterwards to talk about this, and he just basically said to me, "Well," he said, "welcome to England, Alan, because that's just the way that it is." So I realized that
wow.
driving is a little bit more cutthroat,
Yeah,
running over in Europe than what it was back in those days in the United States.
yeah. Sure,
High
sure.
level. I went there and I remember
What a
finishing
place to
seventh,
learn.
and I was scratching my head like, why aren't I first? It was kind of like mystifying to me.
Yeah,
But I was doing my best. But I just needed to learn the car better and learn how to drive the car as the way that the car needed to be driven.
yeah. Which is another
Yeah,
aspect of the route up to F1, isn't it?
yeah,
It's not just results in a step up in car; it's how the
yeah.
car behaves and all that kind of thing.
And all those
Um,
drivers over there, all very good, and that era, of course, great
yeah,
drivers
there was.
through the
I
field,
mean,
and everybody wants to win.
yeah, and there's obviously two names from that year that we're going to come on to in a minute that we all know about. But just go back to your results. I mean, I said that you were in the points twice at Thruxton and at Brands Hatch. Getting into the points, it must have been a confidence booster. You can run up towards the front. Excuse me. And you got your first podium at Silverstone. I remember just
Yeah,
in the. I mean, that must have felt good. Your first podium in British F3, especially with the competition of certainly that year,
yeah.
must have felt good.
Yes, certainly at that time, I mean, the main competition was, between Senna and Brundle. And
Yeah,
Brundle, I switched teams about 5 races in to join Eddie Jordan, and
yeah,
Martin became my teammate. And of course, those were the two guys that were there. But behind them, I was running with Davy Jones, American driver, great natural talent,
yeah.
and went on to race Indy cars and IMSA for a long, long time. I think he won the 24 Hours of Le Mans.
Raced it. Yeah, well,
Calvin Fish, who went on to become the Formula Atlantic champion as well too, commentator. Myself, and it was kind of, I think I finished fifth in the championship in the first year, but with just some great battles at all those fantastic racetracks in England,
yeah. And
and
you
some.
just mentioned the circuits. I'm a bit biased, but I do love the British circuits because there's no two are the same. I mean, you race to places like Thruxton and Brands Hatch and Alton Park and places like that, all with their own challenges. I mean, did you enjoy racing on those I guess those half of them are parkland circuits and
Yeah.
half of them are
Well,
old airfields, aren't they? Like Thruxton and
yes, I
Silverstone.
mean tracks like Cadwell Park, Alton Park, Brands Hatch.
Cadwell.
We raced at the Brands Hatch Club Circuit quite a bit. Donington was a fabulous circuit. Silverstone
Love
Grand Prix
Donington.
circuit was great. A couple of the tracks that weren't so great. I mean, for me, Silverstone Club, which was
Yeah.
basically 3 right-hand corners, that was a bit of a, you know,
It was a bit of
not
a
a,
nothing circuit, wasn't it?
nothing circuit. But the thing is, you're not racing the circuit; you're racing the other drivers.
Yeah.
So in any case, whatever you do, you have to be able to drive those 3 corners 100% to be able to be competitive, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
And that kind of still rings out today. I mean, the short circuit at Silverstone, I think it is only 4 corners now, but everyone who races it goes, "There's 4 tough ones," and you've got to get them right, which is
yeah,
obviously the name of the game.
yeah.
Just very quickly, 83. We all know about the Senna and Brundle thing. You're teammates with Martin. The one incident that stands out was when you got a podium at Alton Park. I guess because of that incident where Ayrton and Martin came together and the one was on top of the other. What was your view of that? Did you go around and see what had happened and think?
I just came around and they were parked one on top of the other on the side of the road, and that's what I saw, and we just carried on racing,
You
right?
just thought,
So
okay,
yeah,
that
it
was
was of course it was quite a dramatic scene, in view of everything in hindsight, and what these drivers went on to achieve in their careers. But at that point in time, there were 2 competitors that were out that crashed into each other, and we kept on racing.
and your focus was that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And you got the podium there, which is always nice to have.
Yeah.
Just before we move on from there, you drove at Macau, which is somewhere I would love to go to.
Yeah.
I think it was Tom Coronel has said it was his favourite circuit. He said he absolutely loves it. It's got a bit of everything. Did you enjoy racing there?
That was the toughest track in the world, in my view. The
Really?
toughest track I ever drove in my career. And, there was parts of it that were very incredibly tight. There's the hairpin where they have the standing yellow flag, because if you get 2 cars side by side, they can't make it around the corner.
Yeah.
And then some
It's the
very
only corner
fast.
in the world, isn't it? It's the only corner in the world that you're not allowed to overtake at.
I believe so. Yeah. In any case,
Wow.
really tough track. Street track, of course, with barriers on either sides. Lots of carnage that happened throughout the weekend, and a difficult track. I think it was the longest racetrack that I'd ever raced on up at that point in time. Very complex with the crowning in the road, and just the blind corners, and the barriers that were right there all the way around, all 4 or 5 miles, however long the track was.
Yeah.
Tough track, but very high profile race, of course.
Yeah.
And just a super experience to be able to go and run there.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm glad you said that, because everyone I've spoken to has said that they absolutely, love the challenge of it. Even if whether they did well or did badly, they love the challenge and the skill involved.
I think I finished 5th there one year, as I recall.
That will do very nicely around Macau. That was the following year, obviously, it was your second year in F3, and you did pretty well. I believe you came second. Was it in second in '84? I think. There was some chap called Johnny Dumfries came along, and he just he was unreal that year, wasn't he?
No, Johnny was racing the year before as well, but then he was taken on to the what was it called, the British Racing for Britain. I think that's what he had, which entailed that he had Volkswagen backing for the motors.
That's it.
And he had BP fuel.
BP were on him, yeah.
And of course, a big budget. By that point in time, it was in my second year, the Grand Prix International sponsorship had stopped.
Right.
And so at that point in time, I was working to, continue racing in British Formula 3 with a view to try to win the championship, knowing that, you win the championship, you made your mark.
Yeah.
And I think I finished second 9 times that year. Johnny just had a great season. He was a superb driver, real gentleman. And when you have everything together, I think his engineer is Andy Green. I remember Andy Green telling me one time, once you know how to win, it's easy. I remember him saying that, and he was able to put together that. That season it was race by race for us, and I was having to continue to try to raise the sponsorship as we went along, and would travel back and forth between Canada and the United States to try to speak to people to put it together in bits and bobs. Eddie Jordan was instrumental in helping me put funding together for me to be able to race, and I'll always remember that, how he was able to put these deals together to help fund my racing career. So through that, we were able to get through the season. We finished second, not where I wanted to be,
Of course.
uh, but there's some things that you just can't change. I made a lot of mistakes that year in my driving, putting pressure on myself
Sure.
to get the results. I think that there was a bit of a performance difference between the Volkswagens and the Toyota that I was running. I think I was the top Toyota runner most of the time, but in the end, it was running in a top level junior championship against some great young drivers.
Yeah,
So
and it was obviously always going to be tough, especially with Johnny's package.
yeah,
And very sadly lost Johnny in the last couple of
yeah,
years.
yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot of love for him. He did well at Le Mans and raced in
yeah.
typical
You know,
things.
you know, following that, Richard in Formula One, he was at Lotus
Yeah,
for his first season when I came into Acela, and
yeah,
it's not like we spent a great deal of time together because we were on two different teams, but we had some commonality there. And I remember
yeah.
sitting beside him at the very first drivers meeting at US Grand Prix in my first race, and he came down and he sat down beside me. And at that point in time, it was the drivers meeting, and maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of the interview, but we're
No,
speaking
that's
about
fine.
Johnny. He came and he sat down beside me, and we spoke a little bit. And when you're driving a car, you're kind of shielded from everybody else, even though you're on the car and you're on track with legends. That's who I was
Yeah,
racing against at that time, and heroes of mine. They're in other vehicles, and I'm in my own world with my helmet on, my own car, doing the best that I can. But then when we went into this drivers meeting, and you started to have drivers that I, looked at from outside the fence, wishing I could be them, or idolizing them. You have Alan Prost, Keke Rosberg, Nelson Piquet, Nigel Mansell, Senna, who I raced against before, starting to stream into the trailer and sitting, within a couple of feet of me. It was a pretty intimidating experience because I'm the new guy and they didn't know who I was. I mean, they're in Formula One, they're in their world, and I'm a new driver trying to, make his mark with zero testing under my belt. And Johnny was there beside me, and we chatted a little bit. And I remember one thing is I think he was still a little bit nervous at that time as well too,
yeah.
because Jacques Lafitte, who was sitting directly across from us, had a little tiny piece of paper, rolled it, and threw it across the room, and it bounced off of Johnny's nose, and everybody laughed, and Johnny turned kind of red at that moment. But Johnny was a good driver. We didn't really maintain contact, but I had a great deal of respect for him, and he always had time for me.
That's lovely. And a nice little memory to have of him as well. Nice little fun
Yeah,
memory of him, which is lovely. And his teammate was out in the sand. I mean,
yeah.
not
He
not
told me
surprised he
that
was a
was
bit nervous.
yeah, that was tough. We talked about that a little bit, and he
Yeah,
said some things that were, I'm not going to talk about right now because he
no,
shared them in confidence with me. But he certainly had his challenges there at Lotus that year.
yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. But no, that's lovely. Nice memory of him. I said at the end of that that F3 year, excuse me, before you got into F1, I just read that you had tests for arrows and Tyrrell. Is that correct? Did you have those
It was with Arrows. I had a test,
arrows?
with the Arrows team. Jackie Oliver gave me a chance to drive it, the car at Donington, and that I did all right. And at that point in time, I was working to try to get into Formula One. The amount of the budget to race in British Formula Three that year was minuscule to what's it takes to run a Formula One team. And what I would do is I would go back and I would speak to friends and contacts and people that I would meet locally, and they would give me $5,000, up to 20,000 dollars than I would take back to be able to continue racing. When you get into Formula One, of course, you're talking, budgets of the top teams at the time, I think were $6 or $7 million a year, I think. And, for what I needed to bring in was, about a half a million to $1 million to be
Wow.
part of these teams. And it was
Yeah.
much different from a guy that was doing most of the work himself, a 23-year-old kid, to try to approach companies like Labatt and Players and the Canadian companies to try to put together a proper business pitch to have them support me
Yeah.
was new to me. And for a lot of these companies, they didn't know what Formula One was, and I would tell them about the global reach, live television audience of some 92 million at that time, spectator audience of 100,000 plus at these races. It was like I'm talking a different language. That a lot of times it was like too good to be true.
I
So
guess they almost couldn't fathom the
yeah, they
figures that
couldn't
were.
fathom that what Formula One was, because you're talking in Western Canada, and the biggest thing that they had in Canada was the Calgary is the Calgary Stampede and the Calgary Flames, hockey team.
The hockey team,
So
yeah.
they couldn't understand this young guy who was trying to get into world championship motor racing.
Wow. I mean, again, that's something that people don't perhaps realize. I mean, they think F1 money and it's fine and you can get the money together because it's F1, but it depends where you're from and
Yeah,
who you've got on board with in the past and things like that.
yeah.
I mean,
Who a lot of cases. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, who you know is the big thing. So obviously it didn't come together for 85, excuse me.
yeah. I think of that year I had there's 5 different teams of which we
Yeah,
were in contact. There was Tyrrell. Ken Tyrrell would have loved to have me, like
yeah.
Martin's teammate. There was Arrows, March, John McDonald.
That was that the Ram
Yeah,
team?
the Ram March, correct. Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, I always love that car. I spoke with Kenny
yeah,
Atchison, who went in there after Manfred was lost, and he
yeah.
said he wasn't very good, but at least the car looked great.
Yes, yeah. There was Spirit, and then there was another team. I can't recall who the other team was. It might come to me, but in any case, there's 5 teams that I was speaking to, and nowadays that would be a really big deal, if
Yeah,
anybody knew about that. But again, back pre-internet days, telephones, trying to reach people, it's hard to get it. And even with the media over here, they really didn't have an understanding when I would speak
right.
to the media, local media, about what this was and what the impact was. They didn't get it. So,
Yeah,
just one of the things of being a Canadian, right,
yeah.
from
Which
Western
is
Canada.
sure. I guess it's one of those things. If the local media don't know what they're pushing, then they're not going to push it. Type thing.
Yeah,
It's
I think that was a bit of a case. Yeah.
must have been more than a bit frustrating, I'm sure. So 85, you didn't have the year of racing. I mean, you did some racing. Excuse me, you did some racing in Mexico, which we'll come back to because you went
Mhm.
back to racing Mexico after that. But 86, you got into F1. You had some backing. Um, Obviously, the situation at the time, in case anyone doesn't know, it was Mark Sura was at Arrows, Christian Danner was in the Osella, wasn't he? And
Mhm.
then Mark, who I had on here earlier this year, had an awful accident in rallying, and
Yeah.
we don't want to talk about that because somebody was lost. Christian obviously made the move over to Arrows. When did you become aware that the Osella seat was available?
Well, during this time, even though Grand Prix International, didn't sponsor me anymore, I became friends with the publisher Michel Koenig, who started to help me out in towards the latter part of 1985, and he was of course in contact with Formula One. I
Right.
had gone down, as you said, and I had the opportunity to go and race down in Mexico for a few races, and I get a phone call from him, and he said that there's a seat that's opening up in Osella because Mark Surer was injured in a crash. Christian Danner, who I knew from days racing in New Zealand, he came down and he did that same series that year as well, and we became friends. He was with Osella and he was moving across, so I
Yeah.
flew to the Canadian Grand Prix from Mexico City, and was there with Michelle, hanging around the Osella team, and I was the only driver that was present. There was drivers, managers that were calling and speaking to Enzo Osella, but I
Right.
was there at the track, and Christian was pushing me. You should get this seat. You should get this seat. he couldn't make the move that race. We were going there with the hope to be able to step into the seat for the Canadian Grand Prix, but
Right,
the
the home race.
FIA would not permit Danner to change from Osella to Arrows for the Canadian Grand Prix. So he raced the Osella, and the day after the race was over, he moved across to Arrows.
Oh, right.
But so I was there, and Osella didn't speak any English. I would speak some Spanish, and my Italian was non-existent. Fortunately, Michelle did speak some Italian, and able to communicate with him and the team. And so what had happened was basically I didn't have backing at the time,
Right.
but I worked to put it together. And essentially, they took Christian's contract, and on Monday, and all the other teams had moved off, but the Osella team stayed behind. They were under their own travel arrangements because they weren't part of the FOCA package at the
Right.
time, the travel package. They didn't have points. So we were in the garages, the old Formula One garage, the Canadian Grand Prix on. They took out a contract, put it on top of a 55-gallon drum, and it was whited out where Christian's name was and where the amount of sponsorship that he was bringing to the team was. And they'd handwritten my name and the amount that they were looking for
And the figure.
to be able to, um, you know, sign the contract, which was like,
Wow.
multi-page contract, all in Italian. And I didn't know what it said, but I knew what the numbers were, and I saw that my name was there to sign at the bottom of it, and so I signed the contract.
Wow.
And the amount of budget that I was able to start with at that time was 35,000 Canadian dollars. That's all the money that I could get, and where it came from was from my grandmother that I had approached, and I said, "Grandma, I've got this opportunity to go to Formula One. Can you help me out with something and take it out of my inheritance?"
Right.
And so I
Wow.
was able, she provided me $35,000. So with that, I was able to go and sign the agreement with Osella.
Wow. That's
So, and
incredible.
up to that point in time, there was a number of Canadian companies that had said, we're not going to help you get to Formula One, but once you get to Formula One, call us.
Right.
And so my thinking was, of course, I'm now in Formula One. I'm going to call them. And so I called these companies. So most of them still said no after that, but I became a Formula One driver that day at the
Wow.
Canadian Grand Prix in the garages on the Monday prior to the race.
I mean, obviously, it's a shame you never got to race in the Canadian Grand Prix, but to actually become
Yeah,
a F1 driver at your home Grand Prix on site, that's kind of cool. And
yeah.
you must have thought, wow, I'm a Formula One driver. I mean,
Mhm.
I can imagine if that was me, then it just wouldn't sink in for a while. But
Yeah,
fantastic.
it was a pretty proud, pretty satisfying moment to, finally be able to say that,
Yeah,
of
yeah,
course. But I hadn't turned a wheel in the car, of course.
sure,
So, yeah,
sure. And obviously, I mean, with no disrespect to us, they were never the most competitive team, just because of they were small team budgets and everything, and unfortunately, probably sadly best known for the loss of Riccardo Paletti a few years earlier is
yeah.
probably where the name was at Canada, which we're not going to go into. But I mean, what did you first think when you got in the car when you drove it? I mean, obviously it's more power and everything. I mean, was it a good car to drive? Despite, I mean, it was underpowered in F1 terms, but was it good to drive that first time?
Well, I had nothing to compare it to.
Sure.
I'd done some testing with the arrows like about, a year and a half prior to that. And so, this was completely new to me, and it was at a new track. It was at the US Grand Prix in Detroit,
Yeah,
street
street
circuit.
circuit.
So my first time in the car was first official practice session on Friday morning.
Wow.
And, coming to get into the car, the team spoke Italian. There was a couple of guys that were put in my car. They spoke a little bit of English. And I was walking down the pit lane for the first time again, surrounded by, Benetton and Williams and McLaren, Brabham, and all these teams. Ken Tyrrell walked up to me, put his hand around my shoulders. We're walking down the pit lane. He said, "Alan, the best thing you can do this weekend is keep it on the island," which he meant keep it out of the barriers.
Yeah, just try and
So,
get to finish.
which I did. My first session, I was just very conservative because what I needed to do is try to feel the torque curve of the motor and understand. And so really feeling the dimensions of the car, the width, the length of the car, because very long wheelbase in these cars, and the driver's seated quite forward in the chassis. So
Yeah.
it was gradually, I mean, it was a matter of gradually trying to feel where the limits of this car were and where the power point was in accelerating this car. And this was an extremely fast car. It still had, I think, in qualifying trim, I think it had 950 horsepower,
Wow.
and in a 1,500 pound car, and so extremely fast.
Yeah.
The power didn't come in, and I remember the engine was just underpowered up until I think 7,500 RPM, nothing at all. And then all of a sudden, between I think it was 7,500 to about 8,000, it came in,
Wow.
boom, and then you had 950 horsepower until about I think 9,500 RPM. So a relatively short,
Wow.
power band, and you had to keep it up in that power band, and the car would go. You could spin the tires in fourth and fifth gear on cold tires.
Wow.
So it was a very fast car, but on the other hand, you're driving this car with, if anybody's driven a Formula car, know that you've got some very small side mirrors
Yeah.
in the car, and usually they're wobbling around quite a bit. So here I am driving on a street circuit for the first time at this track, a
Which is
car that
obviously
I'd
bumpy
driven
as well.
before, bumpy,
Yeah.
and learning how to drive this car, which is a 5-speed manual, big, heavy gearbox, no paddle shifts, no radio, no data, and using these mirrors to make sure that you're not getting in the way of the guys that are battling for the FIA Formula One World Championship. So a bit of
That's
a busy time.
yeah. That's a baptism of fire. And again, I mean, no disrespect to Arcella, they were one of the slower
Yeah.
teams, but even the figures that you're putting out there makes you just think of the cars at the
You
front
know,
end and what they must have been churning out. I mean, wow.
Richard, I think back in the day, there was a lot of disdain for those teams that were at the back of the pack. I remember the media would sometimes be very dismissive of them,
Yeah.
but these guys, these team owners, like Osella, like Minardi, and others that are
Wow.
privateers, they're putting their skin is in the game. They're putting their balls on the line
Yeah.
with their team, going to these races and risking so much to
Yeah.
be there.
Yeah.
And the driving those cars was dangerous because the cars themselves might be a little bit under engineered compared to the other ones. Certainly, there was not very much margin for error because these teams didn't have much in terms of spares,
Sure.
spare motors. I remember the last two races we went to, and I think there was one spare engine, I believe, between Giancarlo and myself for the last two Grand Prix. So
Wow.
you didn't want to pop a motor. So very limited. And I think that a lot more credit needs to be given. And also, not referring to myself, but the drivers that are in Formula One are there. They're all champions and they all have merit to be there. They've won championships somewhere along the line before. So
Yeah.
they're all very, very good drivers.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I feel that the driver doesn't forget how to drive a race car
No.
when they move to a new series. It just may be the circumstances that they're dealt with are not, favorable for them to be competitive.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great point. I mean, one that springs to mind as you say that was like Gabriele Tarquini. I mean, he's gone on to do huge things in touring cars. I've had him on here for a chat, and he just said, "I love my time in F1, but I'd have loved it more if I had a better car."
Yeah.
But that wasn't a dig at, I think it was Coloni we were talking about. And he
Mhm.
said, but there were so many of these teams, and as you say, just risking so much. And
Mhm.
in hindsight, people of my age look back very fondly at the likes of Osella and Minardi and like Zach Speed and all those kinds of teams
That's good. Yeah.
because there was, as you say, there was so much on the line for them, and they were doing it because they wanted it and they loved it.
Mhm.
And that's kind of gone out of F1 now, isn't it? It's all huge money. Everyone's got colossal budgets, and those I guess they're like garagistas, I suppose. They've been going, aren't they? That kind of a thing. Those small teams that everyone loved.
Mhm.
And I always had a soft spot for Osella. They were,
Yeah. Yeah.
just because, as you say, they were almost talked down about, and they really shouldn't have been. So,
Yeah.
but I mean that, yeah, and obviously, I guess with the learning curve that you were on with the car and the speed and all the things you just mentioned, and the fact that it wasn't a competitive car, and you obviously knew that. I mean, I guess the results would have. not mattered, but they weren't. You kind of weren't aiming for podiums and top sixes and things. But was it just a case of let's just see what we can do with this without blowing the thing up because we can't afford to replace it and things like that? Was that the thought process?
That's what the team wanted from me.
Yeah,
Particularly with the sponsorship, was very difficult to be able to come by, and they wanted me. I mean, I was working and working on bringing funding to the team, but I was in arrears at one point in time with the team, and they were telling me, okay, look, we'll keep you in the car, but you got to finish races because we need the prize money, right? We
yeah,
need the start money, we need the prize money, which I have no idea what the arrangement was. That was very secretive, but they wanted me to finish races,
yeah,
and just I was doing my best to try to qualify as well as I could, learn tracks. Sometimes we're going to some circuits and we'd get 6 laps practice, and then I would be stopped at a new circuit and then straight into qualifying.
wow,
So it's just the way that it was. It was challenging. The team just simply could not afford to be able to run the car more than that at
yeah, and go
times.
and do laps and laps and laps of tests around the
But
globe and
in,
things.
in, in racing, we're all optimists. We all feel that if we carry on and we be persistent, that the break that we need is going to be just around the corner.
Yeah,
So
just absolutely the right mentality to have for sure. Excuse me. You had to retire. Had like some turbo issues in like Detroit and at Paul Ricard. Um, One thing that sticks out in the memory of many people, certainly of my age, is the incident at Brands Hatch, the first corner, which very
yeah,
sadly ended Jacques Lafitte's career.
yeah.
Very, very sad. But I mean, obviously, you were caught up in it, no fault of your own. I mean, obviously, Brands Hatch, I love Brands Hatch, most people do. It was just an unfortunate incident, wasn't it? I think, was it Thierry got turned around, didn't he? And then all hell broke loose. I mean, I'm just wondering what your view of it was.
Well, I was at the back. It kind of the drama for me started on Saturday morning.
Hmm.
On Friday practice, I was pretty good. I knew Brands, and that was I think it was my second or third Grand Prix.
Third, I've got here.
And I was running very well for that car. And then on Friday, I got down to some good times. And of course, your closest comparison is your teammate, and I was running at the pace of Giancarlo, maybe a little bit better. I was feeling very confident. The next morning, we went out, and coming out of the pits, down through paddock and up the hill into towards Druids, slight uphill, and I was just on the throttle, holding and maintaining the speed because first lap out at whatever it was, 9 a.m., whatever, very cool,
Yeah.
humid conditions, and suddenly the rear tires lit up, spun me sideways, and I clouded the barrier, and I damaged three corners in the car, as I recall.
Oh, wow.
And
I
so I
didn't know
remember
that.
getting out of the car like this, like what just happened? And it was
Wow.
just completely unexpected. And looking back on it, I think something must have given way on the car, like a half
Right.
shaft or something. It was so odd, but the car
Right.
just went sideways. Just the wheels spun up and went out. And I was not trying to drive hard. And either I was on just at the band where the turbo kicks in, and suddenly the turbo spooled up and spun the tires, or something broke on the car. But that had a major detrimental effect on my season that year because at
Right.
that point in time, I just damaged the car, and I was just new to the team, and the team couldn't afford it. They put me in. I think they fixed the car. They put me into a spare car, which I ran, and getting caught up in that incident, there was just simply nowhere to go, and I was in at the back watching all of
Yeah.
this stuff unfold, and it was just nothing to do but drive into it and get caught up, and then that
Yeah. I
was it.
guess
I
it was
didn't
a.
know anything about Lafitte's injury or anything at that point in time, but I
Oh,
just
right.
knew that my race was over.
Ah, okay. I mean, that's one of those things. I mean, I guess when you're heading into an incident like that, you just kind of think, well, I'm either going to get through it or I'm not. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's one of those things.
yeah,
Yeah. And obviously, it was a good day for the Brits because Nigel went on and won. But I mean, it was
yeah,
it was a shame to see that incident. Obviously, what happened with Jack, and
yeah.
yeah, we never
Of
like to see
course,
it. And
it,
that was
it
actually
ended
on
his
Terry
Formula
Vincent's
One career,
birthday.
but he carried on racing after that,
Yeah, he went on and
right?
did
Yeah,
touring cars and yeah.
yeah,
Just to wrap up the 86, that kind of thing. Where are we? You got finishes in Portugal and Mexico, which I guess must have been nice to get to the finish and get the prize money for the team and just keep things ticking over a bit.
Yes, yeah, it was. Again, good run for the team. Good for me to be able to get the mileage in and get those races complete. But it's like driving in an endurance, in an endurance race. The idea is to get these cars across the line, finish the races, and that was what our objective was. And I'll tell you, Richard, the most stressful time for me in these race events in this it was. And people might find this unusual, but it's coming up the time that you're about to be lapped,
Right.
because you're driving at tracks that were much shorter than what the ones were back in those days. You're usually about 2.5, 3 miles long.
Yeah.
The cars were very, very fast, in a straight line, and there was no radio. All you're relying on are the flags, and you're driving, mid distance, and for me in that car, it was you're going to get lapped sooner or later.
Yeah.
And the last thing you want to do is make your name. You want to be noted by affecting the World Drivers' Championship.
Yeah.
And so
You
you're
don't want to be
driving.
that guy.
Yeah, you don't want to be that guy to get in the way and be branded as that
Yeah.
for the other drivers, for your driving reputation or anything else. But the car is very fast, and what I would have to do is I would have to pull, offline to be able to let these guys come through. But you're pulling offline on a very dirty part of the racetrack. You're getting your tires all dirty and losing a bunch of grip. And that was very hard to be able to judge when you're driving a car that fast. And you're seeing in the mirrors, seeing the blue flags, and you're seeing these cars come up behind them, and you can vaguely identify if the car is, red, white, or yellow, or green. You could kind of see what the colors are. So you got to know who it was, but it's the leaders that are coming up on you.
Yeah.
And you just had to try to pick a moment to affect their race the least amount possible. And that was really, really hard. And that was one thing that was always that was the most stressful part of the weekend for me.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, again, it's something that us non-racers, we don't think about. Obviously with the budgets involved, you don't want to damage the car unnecessarily. You don't want to ruin your race, but you have to get offline, and you don't want to. There's so much going on, and the amount of people that said, "Oh, why isn't so and so getting out of the way earlier?" It's not always possible, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. So the end of '86, when obviously us Brits, we remember it for Nigel Mansell's tyre blowing up. I cried. I was 5. I was really upset. But at the end of that year, was there any possibility of staying on? I read somewhere there was discussions with like LaRousse and things like that. But was did anything ever really come together or nearly come together?
There were like 6 or 7 different teams that we had been speaking to, and it was again required the requisite sponsorship. I had at that point in time retained Labatt that had come on board with me, and they had discussions with LaRousse on my behalf, and I had discussions with a lot of the other teams, but that was the one that they were targeting for whatever reason. But then the Canadian Grand Prix got canceled that year, and it was a matter that the circuit had an agreement with one of the major breweries, and the rights to the Grand Prix was held by the other major brewery between Molson and Labatt. I don't know which one was which, but as a result, they're not going to get along. They're not going to rescind the rights what they have. So the Grand Prix got canceled. Labatt had lost interest in supporting me in F1, and that kind of ended my opportunity. So, but it still was Formula One, Richard, and it wasn't a great career in Formula One, but I did have the opportunity to be there. And a lot of people have commented, why would you go and race with Acela? Well, you don't know when your next opportunity might be, if ever.
Exactly.
And so at least it was the opportunity to be able to do it. And again, being the optimist that all racers are, you think that this opportunity might lead to more.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the mentality you have to have. And if there wasn't the politics between the breweries, then maybe it would have continued. I mean, who knows? But you're in the position where it could have continued one way or another. But which is the best place to be. So thereafter, you did some bits in the World Endurance Championship, Silverstone, and in the Porsche, and the IMSA yeah, the IMSA Camel GT Championship. Did some races there, but I just want to fast forward a bit into 1990 because you drove one, in my mind, one of the coolest looking cars, the Porsche 962 1990 Le Mans pink. Looks absolutely brilliant. How did that opportunity come up? And with the teammates that you had, of course.
Well, I had a call from Eddie Jordan. He said that Richard Lloyd Racing needed a driver over in there. They had this car that they had Watson, John Watson and Bruno Giacomelli, and the third driver was to be John Paul Jr.
Okay.
Great driver. But of course, he had that problem with the criminal record that he had.
Oh yes.
And so he had travel restrictions, which they were trying to get over. I went over. Richard said, "We want John in the car. He's having trouble getting in the country. If he gets here, he's going to drive. But in the meantime, we'll let you drive the car. And we don't want you to damage the car, but you better be fast. You better be on pace. But if we find that you're not, we'll come up with another option." Because they didn't know. They really didn't know who I was. I got it.
That's like cards on the table. So
that's right. I got into a car, and it was a race car, and I was comfortable with the car. Came up to speed pretty quickly on the car, and they kept me in the car, and we end up finishing 11th overall in our first, in the first go. So I got a chance to. I drove the car at the end. I finished because John and Bruno didn't want to drive anymore towards the end of it, and of course for me it was like, what a fantastic opportunity. And so I finished Le Mans in that car, and that car was owned by Nick Mason, and came to the race, and a very nice, understated gentleman came to the race. And after the race, I'm standing there with Nick and with Richard, and they rolled the car in, and they were going to clean the car. And he said, "Don't clean the car. I'm going to put the car into my collection," just as it finished the race.
With all the dirt and the muck.
All the dirt and everything. And he bought that car. He owned that car like 3 weeks before. I think they did one test session in it with John, to run the car in. And that was it. It did one race, and then it went into a collection. I think he sold it since then, but what an amazing, it was an amazing experience. That's for sure. And from there, Richard wanted to contract me for a lot of other racing in that kind of racing, but his sponsorship ended up folding at the end of that year as well too.
So. Yeah, sure. Just a couple of things. I love the 24 Hours of Le Mans. To me, it's the greatest race in the world, and you've obviously competed it. Do you have any sort of standout memories of driving the car or being in the pits or anything like that? I spoke with Karen Chandhok, and he said he's got this image printed in his head of coming off the Mulsanne, and there's some sort of fans of banking just built on the left, and he said there were people with Indian flags, and you could see the barbecues going as the sun was coming up, and he just said it's just imprinted on his memory as just one of the coolest scenes he'd ever seen. Did you have anything like that?
There's so many stories I could tell you about, my racing and that race. The one thing that stands out is the end of the race in the last 30 minutes. Jaguar dominated and won that year.
Yeah.
And then there was 250,000 drunken British fans that were there for 24 hours. And they all kind of streamed onto the track. Wow. It was like driving in one of those rallies in Africa where the fans would open up there. They got the Union Jacks out there, and they're waving on the side of the track. And everybody, all the drivers, had to drive in single file, about 30, 40 miles an hour around the track to complete the last, couple of laps of the race, because they're all streaming onto the track. It was, pretty amazing experience.
It sounds like typical Brits, but it must be quite a cool thing.
It was.
I'm not sure whether to feel proud about that or not. I'm not. But but obviously, and the other thing that should be noted was that you were with Porsche. There were a lot of Porsches in that race. I think the Yost Porsche hadn't made the race because I think Jonathan Palmer had a crash, and the Brun team, they broke down with 15 laps to go. And there were a number of cars that didn't finish, but you guys got it to the end, and you got the Porsche there, and you finished Le Mans. So
and it was, I think, the last Longtail 962C Porsche that raced at Le Mans that year. They put in the chicanes, and so the actual Longtail car became redundant. But Nick Mason still wanted to have a Longtail Porsche.
Brilliant.
So we ran the Longtail version at that track. I finished the race. I don't know if any other Longtails finished the race, but I'm one of the few individuals that would have driven long tail Porsche 962 in the
Wow.
the 24 Hours of Le Mans, finishing the race. So
That's a cool thing to have. I mean, from a spectacle point of view, it was a shame that the chicanes were put in. I think it was down to Kenny Atchison in the Mercedes and the Sauber going 400 kilometers an hour, and they just thought,
yeah,
you can't have this.
yeah,
But yeah, it's a safety thing, so it had to happen. You mentioned like the sponsorship had run out. You did some other races in the World Endurance Championship, but I guess it wasn't feasible to put anything together full time. So, and you moved over to the DTM, the Deutsche Tourenwagenmeisterschaft. For those of you who can say it,
yeah,
there was it was a privateer entry, wasn't it?
yeah.
But as we said off camera, it's become one of the most iconic cars in DTM history. I'll let you take up the running with that one.
Well, essentially, I was working with a hospitality company, and we were over there at the visiting Hockenheim, and saw the DTM, and it's like, wow, this is fantastic
Yeah,
racing.
it was a superb era, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was amazing with just the level of drivers that were there and the manufacturers. You had, of course, BMW, Mercedes, Audi, and Opel and Ford that were there, and I just started walking around and talking to some teams, and the Tauber team were looking for a driver. They just happened to be looking for a driver, and so they put me in the car for a test, and I did well, and so they ended up having me drive with them for the rest of the year, with Tic Tac sponsorship. And it was a privateer team, so the level of the car was not what the factory cars were.
Yeah.
But it was just an incredible experience to be able to do that. I was living in England, and then would commute across to the races in Germany, and then back to England again after the races, and go to all these fabulous circuits. I had just great memories at running at some of these unique German tracks, a lot of airport circuits, but just it was big league racing with a lot of television, the factory support and big crowds.
Yeah, I think that was probably, to me, that kind of there up to about the mid 90s was like the golden era of any touring car, I think, especially in DTM.
Yeah, and really unique format because they would run two races on the Sunday back to back, basically, I think 30 minutes in between races. Wow. And all the teams, except for the privateers such as ours, had spare cars. Right. So these guys would go out and they would race hard, knowing that they had a spare car. But if they revert to the spare car, they start from the back of the grid.
Right.
So in between races, you'd have these guys that were the mechanics were pounding on, the body panels, replacing windscreen, putting race tape over the car for these cars that were being damaged because they wanted to run in the second race. I mean, two races in a row like this. It was just a great format to run, and I remember that very well. And just superb racing. And I learned that I went into it thinking I'm a Formula car driver. I'm pretty good. These drivers that are racing in this type of category are guys that weren't able to be successful in Formula car. So I should do okay here.
Yeah,
I was wrong on that because those guys were just unbelievable world-class drivers and specialists in racing touring cars. Guys like Steve Soper and all the others that were racing. Johnny Chicato was there. Yeah, just some great drivers.
And I've had Steve on here, bit of a legend here in the UK, and he said he loved that format and that era. I mean, you mentioned some of the names. I mean, I actually made a note of them because I couldn't believe the grid. When I looked back and did the research on it, I mean, there was like Frank Bieler, Klaus Ludwig, Hans Stuck, I mean, legend. You said like Johnny Chicato, Steve Soper, Joe Winkelhock, Roland Ash, Jacques Lafitte, Bernd Schneider, Christian Danner, Klaus. You had like Klaus Niedwitz, and really stellar lineup of drivers. And your best result was 8th. I mean, you took an 8th at the Alemannen ring, wasn't it?
Is that right?
I think it was 8th. Was 8th or 7th on the street circuit? Singing, and to get 8th in that company in the car that you said with the lower performance, that's a heck of a feat.
Yeah, so I don't remember that. I just was,
I was just checking all the stats before I came on. But as you say, the Tic Tac livery on the M3, absolute classic. Fantastic car. Was there any opportunity to do any more touring car racing,
I
DTM
wanted
or
to.
just touring cars?
Tauber wanted to keep me on. We were trying to find the backing to be able to do it, but the backing wasn't coming along. I was actually I'd moved to Germany. I was with the Tauber team
Okay.
in and just really working to try to make things happen, but it just it wasn't coming our way.
Yeah.
And I felt really badly when my phone rang, and it was someone that I had met when I was racing in Mexico years before. I didn't really remember him that well, but he was running the Marlboro team
Yeah.
in Mexico, and it was called the Mexican F2 Championship. And the series was sponsored by Marlboro. It was the Marlboro official team. They wanted me to come over and be their number one driver because of the racing that I'd done back there in 1985. I was, pretty successful down there.
Right.
So I went down there, and with the thinking that I'm going down there to check things out, and they actually had the press conference that day that I'm going to be driving with the team, even though
Oh,
nothing was signed. But it was like, here we are in the hotel, El Presidente Chapultepec, with a big press conference, and I wasn't about to say to them, wait
actually,
a minute, we haven't talked about numbers or anything here. It's like, well, I guess I'm going to be racing down here, and it turned out to be about 9 years of racing quite successfully in Mexico, and
wow.
being a professional racing driver and not having to look at sponsorship. Tauber was heartbroken. I felt very badly
I'm sure.
about leaving them, but things weren't coming together by that stage. And I was a racing driver, and I had to do what I had to do. And
Yeah.
it was an opportunity to be with a top team. And, I think that my career down in Mexico, I won about 25% of the races that I had entered.
Wow.
So it was pretty good career down there, getting paid to drive race cars, not getting paid mountains of money to be able to do it. But it was really nice to be able to focus on just the driving
Yeah.
during that time.
Without all the other stuff that was going on. I mean, that just brings back to a comment I saw in the comment section. It's like Tony Algren. He just said, like, what a fighter, calling you a fight. He says, I hope some young spoiled racing kid is watching this. Yeah, it's true. I mean, you spent so many years trying to
Yeah,
get things together and
yeah,
and for one reason or another, it doesn't happen. So as you say, having had those years of the real hard work on the business side, so to speak, to be able to just drive and get paid
yeah.
for it. But I hadn't actually seen the cars that you were racing with, the Marlboro cars until the last couple of weeks when I was really getting into the research on this. It looked fantastic. I mean, someone said that it looked like a cross between one of the old school Indy cars, like the 80s Indy cars and the 80s F1 cars, just sort of sleek but big, and it just looked like it meant business. I mean, did it drive as nicely as it looked?
They were nice cars. It was like a Formula Atlantic car.
Right.
The chassis was in fact a copy of a Ralt RT4, I think, and that's what I ran with the Marlboro team. For several years. And then the opportunities came along, and I transitioned to other types of racing down there. And my last year of racing was I had the opportunity to form my own team, and I was one of 4 drivers on the team. The other 3 drivers were providing the funding for operating of this, and it was my best season ever. It was called the Indy Light Panamericana, and it was races again across in Latin America, primarily in Mexico. But these cars were the former Indy Lights cars, but they had retrofitted Chevy 350s into them. So they were close to 500 horsepower cars. So very fast cars,
Wow.
and very challenging to drive. And I had my best season ever running my own team, probably because I had to be responsible for making sure, like back to my Acela days, keeping it on the island.
Yes.
Because I viewed it as I was the lowest of the priorities, because the other 3 drivers are the ones that are providing the funding for all of
Right.
this. But I just had an amazing season. I think I won 4 out of the 9 races and finished on the podium. Well, there's 10 race series, and I ended up ending my driving career on the 9th race when I clinched the team and drivers championship
Wow.
and won the race with my own team. And so I figured that was as good a time as any to hang up my helmet. And
That's a
by that point
fantastic
in
way
time,
to bow out, isn't it?
yeah. So I just decided I retired on the podium.
All
And
right. So it was there and then you thought, right,
Yep.
this is the way to go.
Yeah, I kind of knew going into that there was a lot of pressure running a team and
Yeah.
driving at the same time. And these, some of the other drivers were in races that were happening before me, and I would be coaching them on the radio. So I was mentally going through these races beforehand, and then I was getting into the Indy Lights car, and I was physically and mentally tired and drained going
Right.
in there. And then I had to do another hour long race, and then with the pressure of everybody looking, and with the hopes and expectations that we were going to win the championship,
Yeah.
which we did, but it was a
Yeah.
lot of pressure. And I thought, I'm going to see if I can try to transition out of this into into something else.
Yeah. It was nice to go out and, as you say, when you're feeling the pressure and you've accomplished a goal, you've won the championship. Definitely a
Yeah.
good time to walk away, and like no thoughts about carrying on. It was just right. That's it. Done.
I really didn't. There was a couple of times that some of the other drivers that I had been racing against had gone on at that stage and had very successful careers in IMSA and transitioning across. But I kind of made the coming up to that race, I was tired, and I was in my 40s at that point in time, I think,
Yeah.
and it was like, there's other things to do in life besides driving race cars. And if I win the championship, I should retire. My wife Erica was there. We were just boyfriend and girlfriend at the time. My mother was there and came down from Canada to see me, and it just seemed to be really. I actually had a really bad run in qualifying, and that for this race, we were putting on the new tires, and I was probably going to take pole anyway, but the mechanic, when he changed the tires, somehow he broke the bleed nipple off of the brake caliper. And so we were out for qualifying. So I ended up like fifth or sixth on the grid. But through circumstances, I was able to drive through and I won the race
Yeah.
and won the championship, clinched the team and drivers championship. And so it was like God was saying something to me, Alan, maybe it's time to really hang up your helmet and look at other things. So I've been very fortunate, Richard, to go through my career. And, certainly I had challenges. I think it just made me stronger and more
Yeah.
determined in what I was doing, and helped me, with my own son's career, of course, because I was never truly successful in Formula One, and I made my living driving a race car, but I never became a household name. And
Sure.
in the United States, I'm more known. I'm known as a racing driver, but that's because of the racing school
The rest
that
is
I've
cool.
created.
Yeah.
I'm not was never really known before that
Yeah.
as a racing driver.
Right.
So I feel I've been very lucky to be able to do. I never injured myself. I continued. I see the other drivers that I've raced against. I see Scott Goodyear, who's um, you know, the the series director for the Formula Ford series that my
Yeah.
son
The
Alex.
USF. Yeah.
And he's hurt himself a few times in race cars, and I'm pretty lucky that I never really had anything major happen to me.
Yeah. Which is great. Which is, if you can get out of it relatively unscathed, it can only be a good thing. I must admit, I'd love to have a chat with Scott. He's had an incredible career.
Yeah.
Um,
You'll need
but
a lot longer than an hour and a half for Scott, I can tell you that.
two-part series.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, so you moved into you became a like driver instructor, I guess. You raced
Mhm.
with the Derek Daly Racing Academy with Skip Barber over at Mosport as well, which I guess you enjoyed. And then you set up your own
Yeah.
driving school, which I guess was something that you had wanted to do for a while.
Well, it's something I got tired of the travel element of it. I moved back to Canada, and there's a racetrack locally, and I wanted to stay in motorsports, which is really all I knew. I was essentially unemployable in the real world for anything else. I didn't really have, as being a Canadian, opportunities to be involved in anything. There wasn't really any professional racing, so to speak, in Canada, and you know, I could continue as a driver's coach, which I did a little bit, but I was tired of the travel. I wanted to start a family. So I started the racing school in Calgary with, took a second mortgage on my place and
Okay.
bought some cars and started operating there. And then, after realizing that the season is so short, the only way to expand this business would be to move to the United States. And so we transitioned to California.
Yeah.
We've been operating at Laguna Seca as kind of their unofficial resident racing school for the last 7 years, and started now to expanded the fleet. Now we have programs operating on both coasts, and
Wow.
we've also gotten into doing a lot of manufacturer driver training programs under NDA for some different top level um, you know automotive manufacturers and helping them with their internal driver training.
Fantastic, and it's great to see that sort of growth. I mean, obviously the weather helps. I mean, in
Yeah,
California
that's for sure.
and where you are, and as you alluded to, it's become very well known over there, on your side of the pond. I mean, we're going to get onto your son very very quickly, but I mean, I know you wanted to speak about sort of what makes a driver, what drivers can learn by coming through your schools, and what you can
Mhm.
offer. I mean, I'm fascinated to hear your take on that process of a development of a driver.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Well, certainly for drivers, and I've learned a lot of this through my son's career, coming from karting through into race cars. That a driver, the younger a driver can start, the more they can have the ingrained skills. But often you'll see drivers that are starting at a very young age that are burned out by the time they're 12, 13, 14 years of age, and they want to move on to something else. And
right,
it's unique to have drivers that can start at such a young age, still have the burning desire to keep on racing as they get up older. I
yeah,
think that nowadays for drivers, because they can start so young, the level of technology that's available with and the coaching that's available that wasn't available when I was racing, like the instruction and the data and the video
mm,
and the high level coaching that can be provided,
yeah,
has really created amazing, talented drivers and very, very competitive, you know,
yeah,
in karts and into formula cars.
yeah,
So the thing is that for me is you're able to make drivers very that you I think that it's gone away a little bit from from what I see in entry level racing in terms of the driver working and engineering the car, and it's relied more upon the race engineer to provide the setup and
right,
to make the decisions on the changes. I think that young drivers might be a little bit less technical than they
sure,
were back in my day when you had to come in and you had to draw a track map and you didn't have an engineer, you had a mechanic, chief mechanic, and
yeah,
between the two of you, you sorted out the race car. And
wow,
so I think that's gone away a little bit, but the
yeah,
level of driving is unbelievably high. But of course, the cost and the expense of the sport has gotten just out of hand as well too.
it's
Back in my
astronomical, isn't
day,
it?
yeah, the season in Formula One, I'll tell you the number was $250,000 that was needed for the Acela team.
Wow,
Which is peanuts. It's
which is yeah,
it's a Formula Four season this
that's
year.
like one that's like
Nowadays,
one F1 race now, isn't it?
yeah, less than that. So,
Wow,
nowadays you're looking at that for karting, they're spending, for a top season of national karting, you're, over six figures. And then you get into formula cars and it's, at least the entry level formula cars is, on par to what a top level of national karting or international karting would be.
wow,
And the drivers are younger and younger. And to me, I think the thing that probably my definition of being a professional racing driver has changed a little bit
right,
over recent years because there are very few seats that are actually paid, and more so, it's drivers that have to pay to be driving the race cars. And unfortunately, all the teams have defaulted to that. That
yeah,
it used to be that a team would take a driver based on merit. They would have some funding, and the driver would come up with funding, and they would make things happen. Nowadays, it's customer racing, which is really unfortunate,
yeah,
and the teams
yeah,
don't even go make any effort to try to find funding to assist a driver, or it's very rare,
yeah,
certainly in the junior levels. So the
yeah.
drivers have to find the funding, which for these young drivers, their only way to be able to have funding is through their family.
Yes, you have
And
to have a start point almost.
to me, the definition of a professional racing driver is one where the family or the driver doesn't pay for his own racing out of his own checkbook. It's
Yeah,
finding the the sponsorship opportunities to be able to pay for the racing. To
yeah,
me, that's what's going to, in the end, unless you're exceptional as a racing driver and you're able to be picked up by a manufacturer or
yeah,
a team or become part of the driver development programs with the Formula One teams. The I think that that's one thing that I believe needs to be developed a little bit more for young drivers is the ability to go out and try to, find the support that they need to go racing. I just
yeah.
kind of see that. The
It,
techniques can be taught. We teach those techniques, how to drive a race car properly. And
yeah,
most of the young drivers we have come in are very good already through karting. they
Yeah.
need a bit of a transition into race cars because it's different. You've got a different mass in that, but they adapt pretty well to it.
No, no.
But,
I mean, and it'd be lovely to get back to a point where that was the most important thing, but as
yeah,
we know, it isn't. And I mean, I don't know if you've heard of her. There was a young lady from the UK called Emily Linscott, and she was in the USF4 Championship. And some of the figures that were being banded around with her, even for USF4, she had the Kiwi Motorsport, I think. And some of
yeah,
the figures, it was astonishing. And it's a bit better over there with the Indy ladder, the F4 and the Indy Next and things like that. The route is a
yeah.
bit easier than say to F1, but it's still incredibly difficult, isn't it? It's incredibly
It's all
tough.
difficult no matter where you go. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's a real shame. As I said, we'd love to get back to the driving ability first, but
Mm.
that ship feels like it's sailed certainly for the foreseeable future. Talk about the future. Your son, Alex, he's doing very well. I mean, he's gone from karting and he's moved up into cars, and he's gone and he secured the factory drive with the Mazda in the MX-5 and things like that. I mean, just talk about his career, his abilities, and where you would perhaps hope to see him go, because he's not really said what he wants to do, does he? He just said, "I'm open to anything."
Well, I think that first of all, when we started racing in Canada years ago, I couldn't afford to even buy him a go kart, and so we got a kart thanks to the local kart shop allowed me to make a purchase of the kart on payments in like 2013 or 2012, and we did some club racing, and he did pretty well. The business started to go better, and he got to the point that if he stayed racing in Alberta, he wasn't going to go anywhere. And of course, he was very enthusiastic. All he's known is racing.
Sure.
He was born in 2006, and I started my racing school in 2007. So that's all he's ever known.
Right.
And he always wanted to race cars. So who am I to say no? But I told him that all we can do is afford to support him through karts. And so we did some national racing, and in the United States, and he was doing well. He got to know a few people, and he's a pretty outgoing guy. And one thing I've kind of always instilled in him is to try to help him not make the same mistakes that I made in my career. When I was young, I was quite introverted and quite shy about meeting people, and I think I could have had a lot more opportunities come my way if I'd been a little bit more outgoing, a little more self confident. And so I kind of instilled that into him, that it's not just about the driving and being in the car, but it's what you do out of the car as well too. He met some people and he caught their attention. And even though he hadn't won a major kart race at that point in time, he was invited to participate in a shootout with Mazda. And they chose, like, I think 18 of the top young kart racers in the United States, national champions, world champions, and they had a shootout for these drivers. And the way I would tell everybody is they picked the top 17 drivers in the United States and Alex, because
Right.
he just hadn't done anything to that point in time, but they saw a potential in him, and in the end, he won it. He won a Mazda factory seat. It got him into cars. Up to that point in time, we were going to go kart racing, and then when it was ended, that was it. And it
Wow.
was always a dream to go car racing, but there was no way we could afford it as a family.
It
So
wasn't really.
Mazda came along and took him under his wing, and he learned a great deal from that. And then another team at that point in time, a Canadian team, Francois Doran, who operates a Formula 4 team. Through the school, I was able to send a couple of drivers his way that were looking to get into
Right.
Formula cars after doing the school. And he gave Alex a test. And he thought Alex was pretty good. And Alex had approached him years ago in karting, and when Francois had his Formula 4 team there, and said, "I want to drive your car one day." And he and Francois kind of hit it off. And then we got a call out of the blue from Francois asking him if he wanted to come and drive an F4. And one of the fellows that had kind of taken a liking to Alex said, "I'll support Alex in his F4 season." And so through that, we were able to join Francois in a very small, meager effort. And, immediately, Alex had been driving my Formula cars, the school cars, since a very early age. I'm a short guy. I'm like about 5'2 3/4. And he's been
Right.
bugging me since about he was 8 years old. "Dad, when can I drive your cars?" And I told him, "Alex, when you're as tall as I am." when he could
Right.
reach the pedals. He got that age when he was 11. And so he started driving the cars since 11 years of age.
That's
And so he's had a lot
fantastic.
of mileage in these entry level Formula cars. So he got
Mm.
into Formula 4, and the car itself was a small team under budget, really difficult times. And he was competitive. In his first weekend, he got penalized in a race. He started last in the third race at his very first F4 race, and he drove from last in 25 car field, and he podiumed. And so he
Wow.
kind of had it, and he's really worked on that, and nurtured. And at this point in time now, he's got about half a dozen different sponsors that support his racing, that cover the cost of his going racing, which is fabulous. And he's kind of learned from my mistakes. He's out there pounding the pavement and doing these things.
Yeah.
And he was hired by Ligier to be their factory test driver. So he actually is. They've got the new generation of Formula 4, and so at 16 years of age, he's a paid factory driver to help them develop this car, which is something I never had. So of course I'm
That's a
extremely proud of him.
that's a
And
fantastic opportunity, isn't it? That's
yeah, he's been
superb.
able to be around people that have mentored him. Not just from me in terms of now the racetrack stuff. There's not a lot that I can really teach him. I help him more on the business guidance on what to do and what not to do, and how to
Sure.
go his career in. And he's trying to go in the direction of getting to Europe, race in the a European F4 series next season, hopefully the British series,
Yeah.
because I think he's still got the right age to be able to go there and learn from there. And if you get a couple of seasons racing in Europe in junior Formula car racing, who knows what it could lead to,
Yeah.
right? That's
Yeah.
where you got to go if you're going to get to Formula One, like as back in my days. But if not, being in Europe, look at Colton Herta,
Yeah.
right? A couple of seasons in Europe, and look where he is in IndyCar today. And in fact,
Yeah.
that was some advice that Brian gave to me. I know Brian reasonably well, and he's
I had Brian on for a chat 18 months ago.
Yeah.
Great guy. And he said the same thing. I mean, he said that, and he obviously mentioned Colton and, for that reason that you've just mentioned. And he said it was the same with guys like Will Power and Scott Dixon coming over from New Zealand. They stopped off in Europe on the way and they've gone and done what they've done. So absolutely right. And,
Yeah.
and it just sounds like he's making some very, very good progress very, very quickly. And I had a quick look at his website just to get a bit of info on him and stuff. And even the website, it just looks like a proper website. It's all worded very nice, and you can. I guess he had a bit of assistance with it, but it just comes across as a very
the website setup, of course, but
Mm.
I think that a lot of the material that's on there he writes himself.
which is mighty impressive because it just looks thoroughly professional. And
Thank you.
from what I've seen, and just doing the research into this, it feels like he's going somewhere. I say he's got the right attitude and the personality, from what I can gather.
As long as he continues to have the drive, right? I've always told him,
Yeah,
the day that he wants to stop racing is perfectly fine, but
Yeah.
He's got to want to do it himself, as any driver does. No matter as a parent how hard you want to see your child succeed at something, it's got to come from within, particularly in endeavors that are as hard as what motorsport are, or any other high level sport.
Yeah. And it absolutely feels like he's got that drive from what I've seen. Far better than I do, of course, but from the outside looking in, it certainly looks like he has. And we, of course, wish him all the very best, all the success. Even, as I said, even from the outside looking in, it looks like he deserves some success because he's got.
Yeah, well, he finally won his first races this past weekend, so he's kind of on his way. Took some time, but finally able to get the car competitive, and there he is.
Yeah, so. Fantastic. One to watch, everyone. Alex Berg. Keep an eye out.
Thank you for the mention on that, Richard.
No, absolutely no problem at all. I mean, as I say, I always look at young drivers and who catches my eye, and there's a couple with various, but yeah, he's certainly caught my eye in the last few weeks. So yeah,
Thank you.
Wish you and him all the best, of course. Right, just gonna sort of wind down. We always have some fun questions, just little silly things that we always like to ask at the end, just some fun ones. let's start with that one. Thomas Parker sent in a comment. Evening, Thomas. Thank you for tuning in. He said, what has been the best racing series that you've competed in? Obviously, you've mentioned World Endurance Championships, F1, DTM, the Mexican series. Which was the best one that you competed in?
That's really hard. It depends on what your definition of the best series is. The most competitive series, the most popular series, the most publicized series. Like by far, the most publicized series would have been my time racing in Mexico and Marlboro F2. These races were televised live or same day time delay. They had crowds of like 70,000 people. In Mexico, just the people are not already aware. There are probably more Mexican drivers racing internationally that have come out of Mexico over the years than just about any other country, due to the huge support and enthusiasm that the country of Mexico and the companies there have for motorsport and for their athletes. In terms of competitiveness, there's so many competitive series that I raced again. I did some rounds of the European F3 series, and I really thought those were very cool. The DTM, of course, being extremely competitive as well too. Formula One is Formula One.
Yeah,
of course, right? But on my own personal performance, of course, the ones that I thought were the best of the championships that I won. The series of the championships I won, but I would say Mexico at that era was on par with any other type of racing series that I'd raced against in terms of the publicity and level of competitiveness. Any of the European championships that I'd raced against as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're not well publicized over here. Certainly, we're a long way away from Mexico. And there's another one, is the Brazilian stock car series. They're that one and anything in Mexico. They're so well supported, so passionate. And I think if any sort of big TV networks ever get wind of that, they could really fly internationally, because they're, as you say, they're hugely well supported. Where should we go very quickly? I was going to ask if you had a favorite driver when you were growing up. I think we covered that with Gilles. Yeah. Bit of a no-brainer, that one. He was just something else. Apart from Alex, do you have a favorite driver now, or someone that you look at?
No, I can't say that I have one favorite driver right now that pops into my head. I have favorite drivers in different categories that I like. I like to see drivers that have that have to work at it to be able to struggle and succeed. In some cases, it's young drivers that are working, fighting, trying to make their way up the ladder. Drivers that come from backgrounds where they face a lot of challenges, like Ocon. I like to hear those stories. I like to hear stories about drivers that have to make a comeback, like Fernando Alonso, right? Those are ones in Formula One, of course. I'm a fan.
He had to prove a lot of doubters wrong when he came back, didn't he?
Pardon me?
He had to prove a lot of doubters wrong when he came back. Even at his age and what he'd done, there were still question marks, and that's
Actually, Alex last year at COTA had a meeting with Alonso and his business partner.
Wow.
And it just really struck me at just how grounded and pleasant is that he was. And I think that sometimes when you go through challenges in life, it gives you some perspective on how good you had it, and then when you have an opportunity to a second chance to be able to come back, you appreciate those opportunities a little bit more.
And you can tell that with Fernando. He just seems so happy, doesn't he? I mean, okay, the results are going well, obviously, but I've always liked Alonso. He gets a lot of stick, but I've always liked him, I think. Just for that reason. Okay. Favorite car you've ever raced?
Gee whiz. I don't know. The Indy Lights cars were pretty fabulous. They were a pretty fast race car.
Yeah.
I had a chance one time to test the Castrol Jag IMSA car.
Oh yeah.
And that was a pretty nice car. I have to say that impressed me mightily, driving that. I like the Indy Lights car. That was the most fun that I've had in a car, was driving a Ralt RT1 Formula Atlantic car, though. That was a car that was before ground effects era.
Yeah.
And that was a car that you could have a little bit of slip ankle and drift the car a little bit and still be fast.
Yeah, great stuff.
Or
I
T1.
I know you're sort of based at Laguna Seca, so you might be biased, but have you got a favourite circuit that you've ever raced at? Is there a favourite track?
Where I drove at, I mean, I
Yeah,
like Monaco. I found the most difficult track to be Macau, as I said. I
yeah.
enjoyed running at Spa. I really like the old Oostenrijk ring.
Oh, yeah.
Tracks in North America, I'd say Sonoma. I never raced there, but I tested there. The Sears Point track, great track.
I've actually been to Sonoma. I was on my honeymoon, and we realised we were up in Las Vegas, San Francisco, and went up to the Napa region just to have a bit of a chill out because
Mhm.
Vegas and San Francisco were tight. And I realised how Sonoma, and I popped in there, and what a fantastic circuit with the hillside there and the setting, and it's a terrific circuit, isn't it?
Yeah.
It doesn't get mentioned enough, I
The
think.
steering wheel is never straight. You're always turning. Even the straight, you've got to be
Yeah, you've got to be
turning.
lined up. Just on that tack, a question from like Diffan Evans. Evening, Diffan. Favorite UK circuit? That's a good one.
Well, I mean, that was back in the day. The tracks were a little bit different. I like Brand's Grand Prix circuit. I think Alton Park back in those days. Cadwell Park was that was a bitch of a circuit driving that one here. So that I'd say that it would be Alton Park. I thought was just a fabulous track.
Brilliant. I mean, it's not changed too much. It's changed a bit, but yeah, it's a terrific circuit. And one thing I will say about Cadwell Park, it's just a bit too narrow for the real top British series. But on
Yeah,
the motorbikes, wow,
yeah,
that's something to watch. But
yeah.
yeah, Alton Park, great circuit. Okay, two more. You've raced most types of cars. Is there something that you would have liked to have had the opportunity to have a go at? Maybe whether it be full IndyCar or NASCAR or the Australian supercars or something. Anything that you'd like to try?
I think IndyCar. I think I would have done well at IndyCar. The opportunity come up. I never really pursued it though, Richard.
Sure.
My goal when I was racing, it was Formula One or nothing else. And so after my season in Formula One, I wasn't really focused on trying to get any other type of racing except Formula One. I did enjoy world endurance racing. I did do that, a little bit of it, and I really enjoyed that atmosphere. I enjoyed the tactics and having to be able to drive a car to the end of the race because I think I had the ability to be pretty good on equipment. And I
Yeah.
think had I done more of it, I would have I wouldn't be able to be. I would have been successful at it. So
Sure.
world endurance, IndyCar,
Yeah.
like
Two.
most others
Yeah. Two
would say.
terrific series. Two terrific series. Final question. It's a this you've raced against many great drivers. Again, I've got a list here. I'm not going to read them all out, but you've raced against the likes of like Senna and Prost and Mansell, PK, and
Mm-hmm.
you raced alongside John Watson. You raced against like Derek Bell and Hans Stuck and Rosberg, Patrese, even guys like Warwick and Andy Wallace at Le Mans, and the guys from the DTM that we mentioned. Is there
Mm-hmm.
anyone that kind of always stuck in your mind as being maybe not the best, but someone just a bit special that you thought, wow, they are very, very good? Was there anyone
In
that
my
stands out?
early career, I thought that Jacques Villeneuve was a very good driver in Formula Atlantic. You know, driving the car that he did, he had amazing car control. I
Yeah,
thought he was a great natural talent. Um, I really had a great deal of respect and friendship for Davy Jones, who of course went on and did some great things. Just a super natural racing driver.
yeah,
I thought he was very good. And of course, Senna. You know that people have said to me, it's what a shame that you had you had to race against Senna that year, but it was fabulous because I was able to compare myself directly to at that point in time you didn't realize this. Everybody knew that he was good, but someone he's arguably the greatest driver of all time, and
yeah,
I had a
and
season
certainly
to
of a
run against
generation.
him.
Yeah,
And yeah, and certainly of the generation in almost identical equipment. We're all driving Ralt RT4s with Toyota Power motors, and very similar cars. And so it was fantastic to see what he accomplished. And certainly living that year in British Formula Three, I could see the obstacles, the challenges he was faced as a foreign driver going up against a British driver in a
yeah,
British series. you know, and so Martin was the hometown favorite.
Yeah,
It's like, you know, going into a football match and going into the Chelsea Stadium and being an opposing team. How much
yeah,
support are you going to get? Not a
yeah,
lot. Senna faced that, and I saw that. Being a foreigner myself, of course, Martin was my teammate. I
yeah,
was with Eddie Jordan that wanted to win the championship, but I could also see it from Ayrton's perspective that
yeah,
he was here an outsider in, coming in to make his name to win the championship, and I felt that it was, quite amazing. And being as a foreigner, we didn't get a chance to touch on it too much. One of the greatest challenges that a driver faces is culture shock moving to the UK.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, that I think a lot of foreign drivers come across from their own country where they're comfortable, they've got their family, their friends, their support system. They move to Europe in order to make a name for themselves. The biggest thing they come over there is loneliness, that they do
yeah,
not have anybody there to be with them. I remember myself in between races, it was me and, you know, in my apartment with four channels, right?
yeah,
Four
yeah.
channels on TV.
I
And
remember that.
usually three of the four channels had either darts, cricket, or soccer or football.
That's all we
So,
had.
yeah.
But I mean, you touched on it there. I mean, just very quickly. I mean, I mentioned we had like Roberto Moreno came on, and he said that was the thing. He bet it was Nelson Piquet pushed him to come to the UK, and he said he got there. He said it was cold, it was wet. I didn't know anyone. I couldn't speak English,
Hmm.
and he said that if you look at his first results, he said they were terrible because he was always thinking about being at home, and we've had drivers who have gone on to race in F3 and F3000 in Japan. Huge culture shock from guys from here, and it's just like it's a big thing, isn't it? I mean, perhaps not so much now because ease of travel and things, but it must have been very difficult back then.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Back in those days, again, there's no internet, there's no emails, there's no FaceTime,
yeah,
right?
there's no
You know,
mobile phones. I mean,
no mobile phones. It was long distance charges to call home or speak to anybody.
wow,
Writing letters the old fashioned way.
yeah,
So, but you make it or you don't, and
yeah,
that's just the nature of the sport. There are sacrifices, and those that are prepared to make those sacrifices and have the determination to stick it on, have a greater likelihood of being successful. And there are many that I know that didn't stick it out,
yeah,
and they weren't. So,
yeah. I think that line is the perfect way to end this, because as someone said, you've, fought for every drive you've had, before the Mexican series, and
yeah,
that's the way it was. And it's been fantastic hearing the stories of what I call my era of racing when I got into it when I was young. So it's fantastic to hear those firsthand from you. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in and for the comments and everything else. But of course, biggest thanks to you, Alan, for coming on, having a chat. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I really appreciate
thank
your
you.
time.
I'm sorry for running on so long on this. This is a lot longer than I think what we were planning on, but I really enjoyed going back. I don't talk often about these times, and when I do, the emotions and the memories kind of flood out. At least the memories that I have, according to my perspective. I might be wrong on a couple of the facts, but
No,
it's been a great fun, Richard. I really enjoy the time and had a great time talking to you.
well, that's great. That's great to hear. And never apologise for talking about motorsport. We can always go on for hours. It's no problem. But no, really appreciate it. Love hearing these tales firsthand. Again, thank you to everyone who's tuned in. And Alan, thanks very much to you again. And do pass on our best wishes and for a long and successful career to Alex as well.
I certainly will, Richard. Hopefully, we'll be meeting up in the UK sometime next year.
Absolutely. There's a cup of something or a pint of something with your name on it. So no
Thank
problem.
you. Okay.
Great stuff. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.